Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Isaac Murphy, The Rise and Fall of a Black Jockey, by Katherine C. Mooney. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Introduction. The table, covered in white cloths and champagne bottles, stretched through a gap in the trees. Sweating in their suits in the August heat, the guests had traveled by private railway car from New York to a dusty glade at the Jersey Shore for this party. They were the Salvatore Club, and they'd come to celebrate their namesake, the stallion acclaimed as the best horse American racing had ever produced. Salvatore, pronounced the Anaconda Standard, as the greatest horse in history, is exerting a distinct influence upon his time. Surely there would soon be Salvatore hats and neckties, Salvatore cocktails, Salvatore cigars, Salvatore playing cards. There were other stars in thoroughbred racing than among the most popular sports in the United States, but New York power brokers didn't stage elaborate outdoor banquets for other horses. They celebrated Salvatore because the big, striding, bright chestnut exerted the centripetal fascination of the greatest athletes. And they respected his owner, James Ben Ali Hagan, the financier who had helped build Anaconda Copper, one of the industry-eating conglomerates that defined the Gilded Age. But they also honored his jockey, the only black man at the table. His name was Isaac Murphy. You may never have heard of him, but everyone you've heard of had. He was born enslaved in 1861. His father died in the Civil War, and his mother supported him by doing domestic work. His family was one among thousands like it in the market towns of the South in the 1860s. We know his story because he didn't live in just any small town. He lived in Lexington, Kentucky, which was, in his youth, working hard to cement the place it still holds as an international center of thoroughbred racing. Before Murphy was in his teens, he was working with horses. As an adult, he became one of the greatest jockeys in history. When Murphy was still a child, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States abolished slavery and instituted birthright citizenship, due process and equal protection of the law, and the right to the franchise for black men. In his lifetime, African Americans worked to give substance to abstractions like freedom and equality in every aspect of their lives. That was a battle through which Isaac Murphy lived and in which some of the people closest to him fought bravely. Murphy's life shows us the daily work of those people, but it also shows us the work of his employers, the men who owned the horses and also often owned the leviathans of American capital, the men who were busy building a society that elevated freedom to make money over equality before the law. Murphy never said much in public. He may have been naturally quiet, or he may have learned in a hard school to keep his thoughts and feelings to himself. And so people attributed to him the thoughts and feelings they wanted him to have. Telling his story is particularly challenging because he left us no personal papers and only a few interviews with reporters who may or may not have faithfully transcribed what he said. This book tries to recover the truth of his life, and part of that truth is what it must have been like to live surrounded by stories about what he meant to people and what they wanted him to be, stories that often drowned out the ones he might have told himself. In black communities and newspapers, celebrations of Murphy's success join tales of other leaders in politics and the professions. In racing results and interviews, in jockeys' room photographs matter-of-factly posed alongside white colleagues, Murphy seemed to prove that a truly free and equal society was possible. He was the example that proved the rule, the sign to point the way. But the very possibility that men like Murphy embodied sparked visceral rejection in many white Americans who refused to live in a society where a black man could be a successful, stylish hero. The political and legal changes that made Murphy's career possible enraged people who throughout his lifetime violently sought to reverse those changes. Meanwhile, courts and legislatures nibbled away at the new amendments to the Constitution so that their guarantees could be drained of meaning. And white Americans told their own stories to make what they were doing seem right and inevitable. They insisted that blackness was a condition that could be described and measured and that determined a person's physical and mental capacities. These kinds of ideas about race often flourished in places assumed to be outside politics, like entertainment and sports, and they underpinned an understanding of the world in which black people had no right to political citizenship because they had very little right to human dignity. Successful black people who supposedly conformed to racial hierarchy without questioning it were praised for doing so. They were the exceptions that proved the rule. And Isaac Murphy was one of the prime examples of those people. He was one of the subjects on which Americans practiced the narratives that would power the racial hierarchies that survived and reshaped themselves after slavery. The stories surrounding his life are texts that illustrate how racism has evolved and how it sorts human beings and assigns them value, how it can flex and cling and find ways to turn its inconsistencies and hypocrisies into vindications and victories. This book seeks to depict Isaac Murphy's life from multiple angles. Sometimes the narrative lingers on one particular view of him, but they are all part of his story. To tell that story is to honor the sacrifice and skill of a man who achieved feats few others have ever even approximated. To tell his story is also to tell of the great stories of 19th century America, the debates over what a world without slavery, a multiracial democracy, might look like, and the battles over who was to hold political power in an economy that increasingly resembled the corporate, wealth-polarized one we know today. And it is to recognize how similar the stories about Murphy are to those that have sprung up around generations of black athletes over decades of civil rights struggles. His story should remind us of the stories of Joe Louis, of Jackie Robinson, of John Carlos and Tommy Smith, of Michael Jordan, of Serena Williams, of the Atlanta Dream, of Colin Kaepernick. It is on the bodies of black athletes that we have written national accounts of citizenship and rights, of deserving and belonging. In the last scene he wrote of his final, unfinished novel, Ralph Ellison envisioned one of his white main characters looking at a series of lithographs and suddenly seeing American history from a new perspective. He examines images of an enslaved mother, of John Brown, of Jack Johnson, and of Isaac Murphy. Maybe he thinks, if he looks at these pictures he can grasp the complex role played in our fractured democracy by the sports and the arts. Maybe he'll glimpse how much has been forgotten or erased, how much could have been and could still be different. Maybe he can understand something about our fractured democracy itself. Chapter 1. Reputable and entitled to credit. America Murphy Burns told the man in the pension office that there was no documentation of her son's birth. Neither she nor the boy's father could write, and there was no means of keeping a record. But she told the man some of her story, and some of the rest we can piece together. America Murphy was born in Lexington, Kentucky, to Green and Annie Murphy, but, like many other enslaved people, she was sold or hired to a farm family in the counties that circled the town. Almost 40% of the people around her were enslaved, and about half of white families owned people. One of those slaveholders was David Tantor of Clark County, east of Lexington. He and his wife Lydia were in their 70s and owned 7 enslaved people in 1860, one of whom was probably America. On either side of them were farms belonging to other prosperous slave-holding Tannors. About 20 miles north, in Bourbon County, was another Tantor family. America could have worked there for a time in the late 1850s when she was in her late teens. That may be how she met Jerry Burns, an enslaved man about 7 years her elder, who was legally the property of C.C. Skillman, the owner of the farm 2 doors down from the Bourbon County Tannors. Jerry Burns was married to a woman his own age named Caroline Oliver, with whom he had 3 children. Mary Skillman, C.C. Skillman's wife, would later testify that they were married as was the custom among slaves, by which she meant that they solicited permission from their owners, held a ceremony, and were afterward recognized by custom as married. Right after Christmas 1859, Jerry and America were married in the same way. In January 1861, America gave birth to a son. 2 months later, so did Caroline. This account is a bare and factual one because the bare facts are all we have, and they could have many meanings, even more than the bare facts of any relationship. Marriage in slavery was inevitably precarious, an attempt to establish a family bond that the law refused to recognize. Enslaved spouses had no legal claim on one another or on their children. Jerry would not have been unusual in entering into partnerships that overlapped chronologically, especially if America lived at least part of the time in the next county. Each woman testified later that she had been his sole wife and the mother of all his children, but they were speaking to government officials who couldn't be expected to understand the imperatives and traumas that had shaped their lives. So we don't know if the two women knew about each other. We don't know how either of them felt about Jerry or how he felt about them. We don't know if he was there when his children were born. We are not even sure exactly where America's son was born. She testified that he had been born on John Brown's farm in Bourbon County, and there was a Brown family living not far from the Skillmans and Tanners. We do know that an enslaved boy was born and recorded as David Tanner's property early in January 1861. Within weeks of the child's birth, most of the South would join South Carolina in seceding from the Union to form a new nation, founded, in the words of Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, upon the great truth that the Negro was not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. In central Kentucky, not all slaveholders agreed with Stephens about the necessity for a new nation. They had depended on the United States to protect and promote the institution of slavery for generations, and they thought their best strategy was to continue to do so. Kentucky remained in the Union. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, it freed only enslaved people in areas actively in rebellion, so its provisions did not apply in the bluegrass. President Lincoln had moreover assured Kentucky slaveholders that, despite the proclamation's language, enslaved Kentuckians would not be enlisted in the nation's armed forces. But determined black men streamed across the borders into Ohio and Tennessee, presenting themselves for service. By the spring of 1864, the Union began offering to compensate slaveholders for allowing enslaved men to enlist, and that June the government began an intense recruiting effort to get black men into uniform. Any black man, with or without the consent of his legal owner, would be accepted into service. On June 24, 1864, Jerry Burns and his friend Charles Skillman, who had been at his wedding to America, went to Lexington and enlisted in the Union Army. Burns was 30 years old, and the mustering agent described him as copper-complexioned and about 5'7". The Army noted that the two men were technically C.C. Skillman's property and that he consented to their enlistment. He may have hoped that it would protect him and younger male family members from service. Even if Skillman approved their departure, the journey would have been dangerous, because Kentucky's slave codes, which legally constrained the behavior of men of color, were still in force. Lawmen as well as vigilantes and Confederate sympathizers regularly arrested, assaulted, or murdered men on their way to enlist. We don't know why Jerry Burns enlisted, but he must have been conscious of how many men like him were doing the same. More than half of Kentucky's enslaved men of military age joined the Union Army during the war, most of them that summer. We don't know how he felt, but we have the words of some of the men around him. Elijah Mars, who enlisted in Louisville 2 months after Burns, found his fear for his family almost too much to bear at his first daily muster. But when the sergeant called his name, he said, "I felt freedom in my bones, and when I saw the American eagle, with outspread wings, upon the American flag, the thought came to me, give me liberty or give me death." Then all fear vanished. His friend said that Jerry Burns never was sick or complaining, but was always on duty and a good soldier and seemingly in the best of health. But almost immediately he came down with one of the infections and fevers common to Civil War camps. Admitted to the hospital at Camp Nelson, south of Lexington, he lingered for months. He died there in the fall of 1864. Later, no one in authority could even remember quite when his life had ended. He had been only one of so many dead. America was not with her husband when he died. She would later ask his friends to help her piece together his final weeks. But as the wife of an African-American soldier, she was vulnerable to threats and attacks from Confederate sympathizers. In the summer of 1865, Union General John M. Palmer announced that the military would issue passes to black people that would allow unrestricted travel. It was freedom in its most basic form, and thousands of people took to the roads. They flooded into Lexington and the surrounding towns. One of those people, in the turbulent wake of the war, was America Murphy Burns. We do not know when she brought her son to Lexington, but we can make a good guess why she did. She probably hoped to join her siblings, who, like her, had been born there and remained close by. And Lexington might have seemed a more hopeful place than the surrounding areas. Between 1860 and 1870, the town's African-American population more than doubled until almost half of its residents were black. Because Kentucky had never seceded, it took the 13th Amendment to free the enslaved people within its borders in the autumn of 1865, and the state was not bound by the terms of Reconstruction, which offered some forms of federal oversight and assistance to people struggling to leave bondage behind. Lexington was one of the epicenters of that struggle. Black migrants to Lexington lived in cheap, previously undeveloped areas, many of them clustering on the eastern side of town, in enclaves owned by local white businessmen. Others squeezed into narrow lots fronting on side streets and alleys closer to downtown. Within those cramped confines, America Murphy Burns would have hoped to secure the first prerequisite of a free life, physical safety for herself and her family. For central Kentucky freed people in the aftermath of the war, that was far from a certainty. The federal government had chartered the Freedmen's Bureau, a one-size-fits-all agency charged with maintaining order, rebuilding the economy, and protecting the civil rights of African Americans on the ground in the South. Bureau officials complained that they encountered more opposition in Kentucky than almost anywhere else. The agents managed to document dozens of assaults, rapes, home invasions, and killings, but they couldn't stop them. General Stephen Burbridge complained in 1865 that policemen and night watchmen who are notorious woman whippers are permitted to go at large unmolested. A third of the total lynchings recorded in Kentucky in the 19th century happened within a decade of the end of the Civil War. Like many other freed women in expanding southern cities, America Murphy Burns did laundry to support her family. White middle-class women could afford to send out their laundry, and they were glad to do it. Laundering meant hauling gallons of water and mountains of soaked cotton and wool, scrubbing and boiling and agitating for hours, suffering burns and blisters from irons and lye. The work was desperately hard, but laundresses were independent contractors. America would have control of her own labor. Easier access to her clients may have been one of the reasons that by the end of the 1860s she was living on Upper Street, not far from the Fayette County Courthouse. That was where she lived in 1869 when she filed a claim on Jerry Burns's survivor's benefit. She explained some of her life to the Army Pension Office in words that fit in the blanks on their forms. She told them about her marriage and her son. She failed to find the doctors who had treated her husband, but she got the testimony of Charles Skillman, who had enlisted with Jerry that day in 1864 and knew about his death, and her own sister Annie, who had been there when the baby was born. She presented herself to the government as a soldier's widow and a good mother. The nation would acknowledge her as an individual who was, in the formulaic words of the depositions, reputable and entitled to credit. The daily work to build a free life, penny by penny, until dignity was an affordable luxury, was constant, but America kept doing it. The pension money, $8 for her and an additional $2 for the support of her son, added to her earnings and helped secure the deed to a narrow lot and house on Pine Street in downtown Lexington. She, her son, and her younger siblings, Annie, a few years her junior, and James, still in his teens, lived there together. She was savvy and determined to take advantage of the new institutions of freedom. Only a month after it opened, she established an account in the Lexington branch of the Freedmen's Bank, a new national institution designed to provide formerly enslaved people a place to secure their money. When James was 16, he opened an account for himself, banking his earnings from his job as a carriage driver. The two sisters continued to do domestic work. America's son, meanwhile, went to school. He joined hundreds of African-American students in Lexington, filing into classrooms their parents staunchly supported in the face of white opposition. When the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, it offered a new vision of citizenship, rooted in due process and equal protection of the law. It was intended to be a negation of centuries of code and custom that had devastated families like America's. The abstractions of the amendment were inspiring, but in the house on Pine Street, she and her siblings and her son were making a life that grounded those gauzy aspirations in reality. A home, a family, a bank account, an education, a future. And because they did the work of making those ideas of citizenship real every day, the Murphys and their neighbors knew when those abstractions still fell short in practice. African Americans in Lexington held community meetings to call for change, to itemize the places where the legacies of slavery still survived in the crevices of the law in Kentucky. Civil rights activists agreed that the best way to combat those legacies was to gain the right to testify in court against white people and the right to vote. Kentucky held firm against African American suffrage until the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. The right to vote ostensibly meant equality in the political process for men, and voting could, at least in areas with larger and more politically active black populations, expend economic opportunity for formerly enslaved people and crack the legal codes that sought to entrench racial subordination. Both white and black Kentuckians were well aware of the implications of black suffrage. As the Kentucky Gazette assured its readers, it would be a calamity justifying almost any measure to protect society from it. Local vigilante and paramilitary groups terrorized potential black voters and their families all over the bluegrass. Black citizens begged Congress to take action. "We have been law-abiding citizens, pay our taxes, and in many parts of the state our people have been refused the right to vote. Many have been slaughtered while attempting to vote. We appeal to you to enact some laws that will protect us and that will enable us to exercise the rights of citizens." The memorialists sent their pleas to Congress because the Kentucky state government shrugged them off. There was no organized white supremacist violence in the state, the legislature insisted, and thus no need to act against it. State courts would not accept black testimony against white defendants, so the only place African Americans could hope for justice was in federal courts, which were empowered to take cases related to black citizens' rights but were often inaccessible to black plaintiffs because of distance or bureaucracy. In 1871, when election officials announced that gubernatorial candidate John Marshall Harlan had won Franklin County by 8 votes, shooting broke out in Frankfort. City police arrested a black Republican activist named Henry Washington for the murder of 2 white men, and a white mob dragged Washington out of jail and hanged him and another African-American prisoner. No one would admit to knowing anything about the perpetrators, but federal courts brought indictments against 3 prominent citizens. The legislature quickly rewrote the law to allow for black testimony in state courts so friendly local juries could hear the case. In April 1872, the Supreme Court made sure that federal courts would no longer be a refuge for black citizens. 4 years earlier, 2 white men named John Blyeu and George Kennard had been indicted in federal court in Kentucky for hacking the Foster family to death. Teenage Richard Foster had survived his injuries long enough to identify the murderers. The state of Kentucky challenged the convictions, and the Supreme Court ruled that Though the Civil Rights Act of 1866 gave federal courts jurisdiction in cases involving people denied their rights in state courts, that protection did not extend to witnesses. The black victims were dead and beyond help, and the federal courts were not obliged to ensure that black witnesses could testify about the crime. The case was sent back to the state courts to be tried under Kentucky's new law allowing black testimony, as was the case of the Frankfort lynchers, who were quickly acquitted. The federal judiciary had made clear that it would define the rights of citizenship for black people as narrowly as possible, and the state government had learned that its best route to negate black citizenship was through legal formalities. It was a lesson they applied very effectively in restricting African Americans' access to the ballot. More than 750 new Republican voters added themselves to the Lexington rolls after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, enough to have an impact in local elections. In response, the city imposed longer residency requirements for voting, as well as a poll tax of $1.50. Those stipulations would disenfranchise about two-thirds of prospective new voters. Men able to pay the new tax still faced the Citizens Guards, a group of prominent white men who patrolled the town during elections. A black bricklayer named William Garner, who lived in Lexington's 3rd Ward on the east side of the city, tried to pay his poll tax, but the tax collector, one of the leaders of the Citizens Guards, refused his money. When he went to vote, Garner presented an affidavit that explained the situation to the officials at his polling place, in accordance with the provisions of the Enforcement Act of 1870, a federal statute intended to compel compliance with the 15th Amendment. 2 out of the 3 election judges present refused to allow him to cast a ballot and were charged with violating the law. When the case came before the Supreme Court as U.S. v. Reese, Attorney Benjamin Buckner, the founding commander of the Citizens Guard, argued that rejecting Garner's ballot was constitutional, since his race was not the official reason for the denial, and the court's majority agreed. The 15th Amendment provided no affirmative right to vote, merely the assurance that the right would not be denied explicitly on the basis of race. Reese would be a permission slip to southern cities and states to disenfranchise black voters, and Lexington a model for how to do it. Speaking at the dedication of a statue of Stonewall Jackson a few months after the decision, the Lost Cause apologist Moses Drury Hogue adamantly rejected the changes wrought by Emancipation and Reconstruction. If it be objected that we have already entered upon one of those political revolutions that never go backward, then I ask, who gave to anyone the authority to say so? Facing relentless attempts to reverse the progress of freedom and equality, black people knew how precarious their gains could be. America Murphy Burns learned that lesson close to home. On Pine Street, the family's neighbors were Harrison and Matilda Williams. Harrison was a laborer, and Matilda took in boarders. Simon Williams, who may have been a relative of theirs, in turn lived with the Murphy sisters. In 1870, the census taker identified America as his wife. Legal marriage would have meant losing the vital assistance of Jerry Burns's military pension, so, like many other couples of the time, the two may have made an informal arrangement, in which Williams was both partner and boarder. But America found the lines defining her labor blurred. What work did she do for pay as a landlady, and what work should she perform for free out of a dutiful affection? What was a loan, and what was a loving offer to help support the family? Those arguments came to Fayette County Court when Simon Williams sued America Murphy Burns for non-payment of a debt of $150. She countered that she had provided domestic services during the 3 years he boarded with her that were worth $200, and he hadn't paid her for them. Instead, they had lived as spouses, and he had promised to marry her, so she would be a wife-in-law as well as labor. Whether or not the two would actually have married and sacrificed the pension money, the promise might have felt like an important guarantee of commitment. Or maybe he had never made the exact promise, but America chose a way that the court would understand to express her feeling of betrayal. She, a woman, who was careful with her money and her future, had cared for him without counting the cost, only to find that he had been keeping an account. Williams denied that he had ever said anything about marriage, though he acknowledged that at some earlier time she might have loaned him money. The case dragged on for years. In December...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?